Has a lost portrait of Anne Boleyn been hiding in plain sight for a century? One of my viewers recently alerted me to a new-ish theory that the long-lost, full-length Lumley portrait of Anne, don't worry if you aren't familiar with it, you will be in a couple of minutes, is actually the same picture as the Lyndhurst portrait of her, now held in New York. Said viewer asked if I'd look into it, and I did. So is there any real evidence to support this claim, or are we in the realms of historical fiction? Stay tuned to get my analysis of this theory, and quick disclaimer, all accusations of plagiarism or any other misconduct made anywhere in this video and any criticism it contains of any individual are of course just my opinions, nothing more. As I'm sure you already know if you clicked on this video, Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, King of England, and the mother of Elizabeth I. She was executed on Henry's orders on the 19th of May 1536 at the Tower of London. The only image we have of her, which we know was created during her lifetime, is a damaged lead medal created in 1534 and now held in the British Museum. All other known portraits are either assumed or known for certain to date to the 1550s or later, though there are two drawings by Hans Holbein the Younger which some claim are her. I, however, don't think either one is, and I already have a YouTube video explaining why I don't believe the double-chinned blonde woman in her nightie is the famously brunette, fashion-conscious Queen of England, despite what the label bearing her name, which was added hundreds of years later in an 18th century hand, says. I'll leave that episode linked for you. Of the portraits which we know are meant to show her, and which date to the 16th and 17th centuries, many follow a similar pattern. They show Anne in a black dress and French hood, with dark hair and eyes, wearing a bee pendant on a pearl necklace which is wrapped around her neck twice, unless there are two pearl necklaces here, which is possible. There are 3 pearls hanging below the bee. Again, I have an entire video specifically on the necklace, which I'll leave linked for you, so I've looked at many of these bee pattern portraits before. The most famous of them are one held in the National Portrait Gallery in London, known as the NPG for short, and another at her family home, Hever Castle, known as the Hever Rose portrait, because in it she's holding a red rose to symbolise her husband's Lancastrian family. This is the only bee pattern where we can see her hands, by the way. Hever also has another couple of bee pattern portraits which are less famous because they are assumed to be younger. The NPG portrait has been dated to 1584 or later through dendrochronology, which is the dating of the wooden panel on which it was painted. It tells us that that was the year in which the tree was felled that the panel was made from, so the portrait has to have been created after that point. The Hever Rose portrait is undated, and according to Dr. Owen Emerson, who works at Hever and who has a good video about the Rose portrait on his own YouTube channel, which I'll link for you, its provenance is unknown beyond either 1935, when it was definitely at Hever, or 1904, when it might have been at Assington Hall, though it was actually created in the 16th century. Now for the Lumley portrait. This is a lost, full-length portrait of Anne which was in the possession of John Baron Lumley in 1590, and which we know about because it appears in an inventory of his goods taken in that year by his steward of the household, a Mr. John Lambton. This inventory describes the portrait as the statuary of Queen Anne Boleyn. Now the word statuary in this context means full length. We can be sure of that because there is a little piece of text in the inventory saying this list of paintings is a note of pictures carrying the form of the whole statuary. If we were still in any doubt that it means whole length, we need only look at the entry beneath Anne's painting, which refers to a unique and very famous full-length portrait of Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan and Lorraine by Hans Holbein, which now hangs in the National Gallery in London. It is also referred to as a statuary, so the word absolutely means a full-length portrait. If you want to learn more about Christina, the girl who escaped being the 4th wife of Henry VIII by the skin of her teeth, I'll leave my video about her incredible life linked below for you. A second possible allusion to the Lumley portrait in the historical record is in connection with a miniature portrait of Anne Boleyn painted by John Hoskins the Elder for Charles I and now held in the Duke of Buccleuch and Queensberry's collection. We don't know exactly when it was created, but to give you some dates, Hoskins was born in about 1590 and his earliest miniatures date to around 1615. Charles was born in 1600, became king in 1625 and died in 1649. Hoskins died in 1665. So the miniature could technically date to anywhere between the late 1610s and the late 1640s, but I think the 1620s and 1630s are more likely after Charles became king, but before he and his kingdoms were distracted by the civil wars of the 1640s. It's worth noting that he granted Hoskins a £200 annuity for life on the 30th of April 1640, quote, provided that he work not for any other without his Majesty's licence. However, it wasn't paid after the first year due to the political situation in the country. On the back of the Hoskins miniature are the words, "From an ancient original." Now, Eric Ives, who wrote what I consider to be the best biography of Anne ever published, another thing I'll link for you, this is going to be one of those videos with ties to a lot of other pieces of content, floated the idea that this miniature might be based on the Lumley portrait. However, he was cautious in his approach, noting that it was impossible to tell how ancient this supposed original was, and that connecting the two was mere speculation. Still, he considered the Hoskins miniature to be, quote, the best depiction of Anne we are likely ever to have, failing the discovery of new material, and no matter what earlier image it was based on. We have only one other historical reference to what was almost certainly the Lumley portrait, and that comes on the 2nd of April 1773, when it was sold at the auction of the property of the recently deceased politician and antiquary James West of London. The catalogue, which I didn't see shown or quoted in full anywhere else on the internet during research for this video, and I did Google bits of it to check, describes it as follows. A ditto, meaning a portrait, of Anne Boleyn with a veil, brought from the palace at Nonsuch. This picture was originally an whole length, but being damaged at the fire in the Temple, which is an area of London known for its connections to the legal profession, in the year 1736 was obliged to be cut. A few things to note here. First, this information does not tell us where the portrait was cut off. Was it at the knees, the waist, the bust line? Who knows? Second, it's unclear from the way this is worded if the painting was damaged in 1736 or merely cut down in that year. We don't know for sure which fire in the Temple is being referred to. There was the Great Fire of London, of course, in 1666, but why would it only be cut down in 1736 if it had been badly damaged 70 years earlier? Make sure you stay with me because I'm going to come back to this little mystery later on and offer an explanation for it. Third, to the left of this text in the original sale catalogue is a typed note which says that this portrait was a Holbein, and then, in someone's handwriting, that it was either on sale or eventually sold to an unknown buyer for £2, which is about £265 today. Finally, I'd like to say a word about its provenance and how we might connect it to the Lumley portrait. This description doesn't mention Lumley. However, it does say that the picture came from Nonsuch Palace. Nonsuch was built by Henry VIII starting in 1538 and was inherited by his son Edward VI, then Henry's daughter Mary I, who sold it, still unfinished, in 1556 to Henry Fitzalan, 12th Earl of Arundel, who was the Lord Steward of her household. Arundel was John Lumley's father-in-law, and after the Earl's death, Lord Lumley inherited and continued to live at the palace until 1591, when he sold it to Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I. The palace was then inherited by James I in 1603, who gave it to his wife Anne of Denmark, and it was inherited by their son, Charles I. It was taken over by the Cromwellians at the time of the interregnum, but restored to royal hands in 1660 when Charles II got back his throne. He ultimately gave it to his mistress, Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, who allowed it to be torn down for parts in the 1680s. Now, I think it highly unlikely that Lumley owned a full length of Anne in 1590 when he also owned Nonsuch Palace, and that another full-length portrait of her popped up in 1773, which also had a connection to that building. It's not impossible, but on the basis of the evidence available, I don't dispute that they do seem most likely to be the same image. As important as what this description does say is what it does not. Most notably, it doesn't mention the sitter's necklace. It says she's wearing a veil, but gang, Anne's wearing a hood and veil in almost all the near contemporary images of her. The only one I can think of where she's not is an early image of her execution. It was standard dress for the time period. English ladies rarely posed for pictures with their hair out. If she'd had a distinctive bee pendant around her neck, would that not have been mentioned as a good way to identify the picture? Mind you, the description doesn't even tell us the colour of her dress or how she was posed, so perhaps the writer just wasn't one for details. In fact, something I'd also like you to consider is that the Lumley portrait may not have even been of Anne. It's entirely possible that it was mislabelled and that this whole discussion is based around a wild goose chase. After all, we know of many famous pictures that have been misidentified. I've already told you why I don't believe the Holbein drawing of a blonde woman in her undergarments is Anne, despite the later caption. And to give another few examples, there are other drawings by Holbein mistakenly referred to as Anne Boleyn's brother George, sister-in-law Jane Parker, and father Thomas Boleyn. My YouTube videos explaining why none of these labels are correct are linked below, as is one on a full-length portrait of Catherine Parr, 6th wife to Henry VIII, which was long believed to be the much younger Lady Jane Grey. So misattributions are a relatively common occurrence, especially when people are desperate to say that they found a picture of a person for whom few, if any, other images exist. So there you have it. Those 3 pieces of evidence are all the primary source documentation we have which either do or might refer to the Lumley portrait. We now get to the event which sparked this video. As I've mentioned, one of my viewers asked me recently if I knew about the alleged photography of the Lumley portrait. Thank you to said viewer, by the way, for putting this on my radar. This caught my attention because I already knew what the Lumley portrait was. This isn't the first time I've mentioned it on my channel. I knew that the trail went dead on it in the late 18th century, and I knew that photography as we know it today wasn't invented until the 1820s, so I knew there couldn't be a photograph of this portrait. I got Googling. I found what I was after within minutes, and that was a theory self-published in December 2024 by an Italian-American amateur historian called Elizabeth LaVasse in a book she entitled Anne Boleyn, A History in Portraits. I'm going to run you through what she claims now, and I'll explain as I go along why I found this to be one of the most obvious and frustrating examples, to me, of pseudo-history that I've ever come across, and why I found it absolutely laughable that the author described it in the Amazon description as meticulously researched. Ms LaVasse's theory runs like this. The Lumley portrait was created during Anne Boleyn's lifetime between 1532 and 1536, and LaVasse says that, quote, "It is a fact there was a full-body portrait of Anne that hung at Hever Castle, which she is claiming was the Lumley. She further suggests that it might have been painted while Anne was in France with Henry VIII in the autumn of 1532 to celebrate her being made Marchioness of Pembroke, though LaVasse makes one of her frequent errors here by saying Anne was made a marquisate. That's like saying a man was made a dukedom instead of a duke." She carries on that, quote, "Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were painted by the artist Jules Van Cleve, apologies if I've mispronounced his first name, likely in portraits that were meant to be hung together as the future of the realm, with their eyes looking specifically ahead in the same direction, possibly at a doorway." This painter, by the way, may well have come from Cleves, but is most heavily associated with Antwerp, and he lived between about 1485 and 1541. LaVasse then says that Hever Castle was taken by the Crown in 1539 after Anne's father Thomas Boleyn died, and given to Henry VIII's 4th wife Anne of Cleves in 1540 as part of her annulment settlement. She therefore owned the portrait, then willed it to Henry FitzAlan, 12th Earl of Arundel, who was her executor. He therefore inherited it upon her death in 1557. When he died in 1580, he willed it to his son-in-law, John Baron Lumley, and that's why we find it in an inventory of Lumley's possessions in 1590. She then claims that in 1609, upon Lumley's death, the portrait went to Prince Henry Stuart, eldest son of James I, and was then inherited by Prince Henry's younger brother, the future Charles I, upon Prince Henry's death in 1612. It was likely used to create the Hoskins miniature, and I did appreciate her saying likely there and not stating outright that it was used by Hoskins, because as I've said, we just don't know which image he saw. Was supposedly brought back into royal ownership by Charles II in 1660 after the interregnum, and put up in the inner or middle temple, where it was damaged by fire in either 1679 or 1773. Confusingly, she gives both dates at different points, then cut off at the bust. She then claims it was bought by James West in 1728, that he died in 1772, and that it was auctioned off along with the rest of his possessions in 1773. Let's just pause here to fact-check what is so far a very messy mixture of some truths and some fantasy, and then I'll move on and explain how LaVasse claims she either knows or strongly suspects, she flip-flops on the idea a bit, where the portrait is today. First off, we don't know when the Lumley portrait was created. It pops up in the inventory of 1590, but for all we know, it was only painted the year before. After all, the NPG portrait of Anne dates to 1584 or later. Heck, I even consider the idea that they're one and the same, because as far as I'm aware, the NPG doesn't have a known provenance going back that far. However, I've never heard any talk that the NPG shows fire damage or evidence of being cut down. There is no evidence that the Lumley portrait hung at Hever Castle, nor is there any evidence that a full-length portrait of Anne ever hung there. The connection with the artist Van Cleve and the 1532 trip to France, a theory which is completely unsupported by any primary source evidence that I've ever come across, is not, I believe, even an idea that LaVasse came up with herself, though she does very little to notify her audience of this. She does say, quote, claims have also been made that the original Howard Young Gallery portrait, I'm going to be explaining what this is in detail in a few minutes, but all you need to know for now is that LaVasse thinks it's a photograph of the Lumley, could have been created, if contemporarily, by Jus Van Cleve, or by Master John at the court of Henry VIII. But not only is this a far cry from the other statement she makes, which presents the Van Cleve origin as fact, she also doesn't say who made the claims, and there are no footnotes, endnotes, or proper in-text citations in her work. I traced this theory to a 2017 article linked below and written by historical novelist Richard Masefield, then published on the Anne Boleyn Files website. I'm going to assume he came up with that theory, but it's always possible that he read it somewhere else, as I don't have time to go down the rabbit hole to try to check that out. I don't believe LaVasse's vague and unsighted reference to claims comes close to giving sufficient credit to Masefield, or anyone else for that matter, and though you are of course free to believe as you wish, based on the evidence I've been able to find, personally I would class this as plagiarism of what appears to be Masefield's idea. As for her mention of Master John, I don't know where that came from because again there's no citation. However, he was only active at the Tudor court between circa 1544 and 1550, so it's daft to associate him with a supposed portrait of Anne created during her lifetime. Now it is true that Hever Castle came to the crown after Thomas Boleyn's death. However, as its website points out, this only happened at the very end of 1540, when Thomas's brother James, who had inherited it, quote, sold it for £200 to the crown by indenture. It was then granted to Anne of Cleves, so she didn't get it at the time of the initial annulment in the summer of 1540. She got Richmond and Bletchingley, then was allowed to lease Hever a little later. Anne of Cleves did make the 12th Earl of Arundel one of her executors. However, the painting is not mentioned in her will, contrary to LaVasse's claims. In fact, what she did leave Arundel was a Magdalen standing cup of gold with a cover. His countess was to get a ring of gold with a fair table diamond having an H and an I of gold set under the stone. I know these details because the will was published in the 19th century and has been freely available online for years. I even did an entire YouTube video looking at just this document. Having created that video, I was already pretty familiar with the will, but nevertheless, I went back and read it again, twice, just to be sure. In addition, if Anne of Cleves did own the portrait and was free to do as she wished with it, I would find it odd that she didn't leave it to Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth Tudor, to whom she made a point of bequeathing her second best jewel. The first best went to Queen Mary I. I don't even think that this whole train of inheritance is even LaVasse's own idea either. It also shows up in the Macefield article, making it even more unlikely, in my opinion, that LaVasse didn't steal his ideas, simply because so many of them crop up in her book without any credit being given to him. Furthermore, even if we're very generous and say that she coincidentally came up with the ideas independently, it really doesn't reflect well on her that she either did so little research that she didn't notice that another writer had published exactly the same ideas years earlier, or she did and then she didn't cite him. Again, I'd like to remind you that she claimed in the Amazon description of the book, as it appears at the time of creating this video, that it was meticulously researched, and truly, I have to wonder what on earth would merit the definition of poor research for her if this book is her version of meticulous, because I have to tell you, it's my version of abysmal. Now, I'm afraid that whether it's coming from Macefield or LaVasse, I don't buy into this chain of evidence, from Hever to Anne of Cleves to Arundel to Lumley, for one simple reason that both these writers appear to have missed. Upon Anne of Cleves' death, Hever Castle and all its contents reverted to the Crown. She had only rented the castle for £9 13 shillings 3.5 pence per annum, if you're interested. She didn't own it, and she was not able to do anything with the contents that weren't her personal property. That's why if you read her will, you'll see that it doesn't mention her houses or their contents, never mind a specific painting. So Lord Arundel couldn't have been left the painting. However, despite knowing this, just for the sake of thoroughness, I got a digitised copy of his will from the UK National Archives and read it too. Surprise, surprise, there's no mention of a portrait of Anne Boleyn in it, though Arundel did leave most of his possessions to Lumley. LaVasse also overlooks the fact that Arundel thought for a while that he was in the running to marry Elizabeth I and made a point of wooing her. It seems to me that a good way to do that would have been to give her a portrait of her mother if he'd actually had one. I'd like to pause here just for a minute to look at the general quality of LaVasse's work, as you can probably tell already that I'm very unimpressed. She does not provide any citations in the entire chapter on this portrait, or indeed in the rest of her short 85-page book. As well as no citations, there is no index, no bibliography, no illustrations list, and many illustrations are not captioned, so you're just left to wonder where she sourced them from. As for the formatting, the text isn't even justified on the page and is often spaced differently, giving a desperately disjointed look. The entire book, which I did read, is also absolutely littered with factual errors and bad grammar. I can't list them all, but just sticking with the Lumley portrait chapter, I've mentioned the Marquisate clangor, but there's also the time LaVasse calls John Lambton, John Lambden with a B instead of a P, the places where she calls Anne of Cleves the fifth wife of Henry VIII and says that their annulment took place in 1550. Then there's a bit where she says that Anne of Cleves inherited Hever Castle instead of leasing it, and when she quotes the 1590 inventory, she misquotes it even aside from the Lambton mistake. She adds on to the line, the statuary of Queen Anne Boleyn, the words, that of his second wife is at Lumley. Where on earth is this coming from? Well, if you look at the inventory, you can see that another entry on it reads, the statuary of both your lord's wives, and there is a little footnote attached to those words. Go to the bottom of the page and you see that the footnote reads, that of his second wife is at Lumley. Why LaVasse has associated this totally unrelated piece of text with the line about Anne Boleyn is beyond me. As far as I know, based on listening to a podcast interview she gave to promote this book, she has no university training as an historian, and if that's true, it really doesn't surprise me based on what I've observed in this book. I actually have a free guide to spotting bad history books, which you can get by signing up to my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, and this book hits all the red flags that I raise in that download. So why not consider signing up to my mailing list to get it, plus another complimentary download and my monthly newsletters. You can unsubscribe at any time. Moving on. While we know that John Lumley owned the painting, even if we don't know how he got it, there is no real evidence that Prince Henry Stuart possessed it. But again, this idea seems to have been lifted from Masefield, who wrote that it may well have been purchased for his new library gallery at St James's Palace by James I's eldest son, Prince Henry Frederick, who is known to have acquired the Lumley collection of books and manuscripts and was an avid collector of Renaissance paintings. This is an interesting idea because it suggests that the painting was bought by the teenage Prince Henry rather than the alternative, which is that it was inherited by the Stuarts along with Nonsuch, a connection which LaVasse does not make and which Masefield deems unlikely. I, on the other hand, think that the fact that the 1773 auction guide specifically mentions Nonsuch means that we shouldn't discount this as the place it stayed long after Lumley's death and perhaps as late as the reign of Charles II. If Prince Henry did get it, one way or the other, I concede that it's certainly possible he left it to his brother Charles I, another of Masefield's ideas, but this is hardly conclusive. Something I did appreciate Masefield saying was that we are just assuming that the Hoskins miniature was copied from a painting in Charles I's possession. We don't actually know that, which I think is a great point. Maybe this ancient original was owned by someone else. There is no evidence that the Lumley was reacquired by Charles II in 1660, a date which seems to have been chosen because it's the year of the restoration of the monarchy and because Masefield said it. And as you know from the real evidence I've already taken you through, we don't truly know what happened to the painting between 1590 and 1773, because the idea that it was the basis of the Hoskins miniature is just supposition. There is also no evidence that the fire damage it suffered happened in 1679 or 1773, though there was a fire at the temple in the earlier of those years. If we return to the 1773 sale catalogue, I just want to reiterate my earlier point that the way it is worded is in fact ambiguous. It could mean that the fire occurred in 1736, or that it occurred earlier and the painting was just eventually cut down in 1736. It does not say that it was cut to bust level. That is another invention. It could have been cut as high up as the neck, for instance, just like the injury the real Anne suffered, in which case it would be no wonder that the description didn't mention her necklace. Personally, I don't think LaVasse ever read the 1773 catalogue. She shows no knowledge of the other information it gives, like Anne wearing a veil, the painting's connection to Nonsuch Palace, or the fact that it was listed as a Holbein, and I suspect that she just saw a part of the catalogue entry cited in another secondary source, copied it, and didn't bother locating and looking at the original document itself. It's certainly noticeable that neither it nor the 1590 inventory, both of which I've shown you, appear as images in her book. Now, while it is of course true that the portrait must have been in the possession of James West by 1772, when he died, in order to be auctioned off in 1773, we don't know when or how he acquired it, and there is no evidence that he bought it in 1728, as LaVasse claims. Instead, this seems to be a misreading on her part of something Masefield wrote when he said that he thought James West probably saw it first in that year. What I can tell you is that a little digging by yours truly here at History Calling unearthed a much more plausible, though still ultimately unprovable, theory as to how the fire damage occurred. If you read James West's entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, you learn that he trained as a lawyer and worked in the Inner Temple. You then learn that, quote, West collected books, manuscripts, pictures, prints, plate, coins and medals, but lost many items valued at almost £3,000 through a fire in his chambers at the Inner Temple on the 4th of January 1737. Now, prior to 1752, the new year in England was taken to begin on the 25th of March, and so this fire in January 1737 would have occurred in 1736, according to the calendar in use at the time. This tallies very nicely with the line in the 1773 catalogue that the full length of Anne was damaged and or cut down in that year. Again, LaVasse demonstrates no knowledge of any of this information, nor does Masefield actually, which was more surprising because he cites the Oxford DMB in his blog post. He posits that the fire damage happened during the Great Fire of London, though as I've said, I disagree with that theory because it makes no sense to me when we consider that the portrait was only cut down 70 years later. Now we get to the part where LaVasse tries to claim that she knows where the painting is today. In 1926, a B pattern portrait of Anne was photographed in sepia by the Howard Young Gallery in New York. This photograph is now available online in the Frick collection. We don't know what happened to the portrait it shows, but it is the genesis of the whole idea that Masefield had, and which I think LaVasse has regurgitated, that Van Cleve painted Anne in 1532. Now, Masefield seems to have based this hypothesis solely on the facts that he thinks it resembles some other Van Cleves, and Henry VIII was painted by that artist, which I find unconvincing, especially as I saw the Van Cleve portrait of Henry in the King's Gallery in London, and the label next to it said that it is suspected it was not painted from life, but rather copied from a miniature by Lucas Hornbout, which Francis I owned. On the other hand, the Royal Collection's website says it might indeed have been painted to commemorate the 1532 meeting, so who knows. Now, something I need to flag up about the Masefield article before we go any further is the following. He doesn't state in the main text where he obtained 2 black and white photos of the portrait he thinks is a Van Cleve painting, though he also shows a sepia version that appears to have come from the Frick Collection website. Unless maybe that was added in by the woman who runs the Anne Boleyn Files website, I don't know. Instead, he just says that they are recently discovered prints of a lost painting. Thankfully, someone asked him in a question in the comments under that article where he got them, and he said, quote, "The print was discovered in an old biography of Henry VIII and also appears, differently cropped, in a collection of supposed images of Anne Boleyn on Alison Weir's website. It would be good to know where the original is held, and also, of course, if a painting survives." Now, it's unfortunate that he doesn't say which biography of Henry VIII he's talking about, as there are simply far too many of them for me to go hunting for this, and I would love to know what year it was published and who the photo and/or portrait is attributed to see if that can help us trace the portrait better. But looking at the 2 images he provides, personally I am in no doubt that they show the 1926 photo on the Frick Collection's website, or at the very least a photograph of the same portrait. I looked at Ms Weir's website too, but didn't see the photograph there. However, she may well have removed it in the intervening years since this comment was posted, or I might have missed it. There is a lot on her website. As I said, I don't think this ultimately matters because I am confident that the images shown do display the same photograph seen on the Frick Collection's website, but I wanted to mention it in the interests of full disclosure. We're still only up to 1926 though. Why does LaVasse think she knows where this missing portrait in the photo is today? In 1940, another B-pattern portrait of Anne showed up and was purchased by Anna Gould, Duchess of Talleyrand and Dino, who bought it from the Meredith Galleries. We don't know where it came from before that, but it is now known as the Lyndhurst portrait after the name of the mansion in which it is held in New York, and it is in the care of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, to whom it went after the Duchess's death in 1961. LaVasse contends that the image in the 1926 photo shows the Lyndhurst portrait, and that any differences between them, which she does not bother discussing in any detail, but one would be the bump on Anne's nose in the Lyndhurst, can be accounted for by overpainting. She does not allow for the idea that they are 2 distinct copies of a lost original. Once again, allow me to show you why this idea appears to have been plagiarized from someone else. If we look at the comments section under the Masefield article, we see one left from a user called Roland H on the 20th of September 2017, in which he says of the photographs discussed in the article, which I think show the Frick Collection's 1926 picture, remember, "I believe it is a modern reinterpretation of a specific variant of the B pendant type portrait which shows Anne looking upwards, perhaps the very version owned by Lyndhurst Mansion in New York." This idea appears again, much more fleshed out, in an article I'll link below for you, published on the website Lady Jane Grey Revisited in September 2020, the author of which is a man named Lee Porritt. Now, I don't know if Mr. Porritt came up with the idea that the 1926 photo and the Lyndhurst are the same, independently of Roland H., or if he read that comment, or if he saw the same idea somewhere else. Looking at his website though, he seems like someone who does his research and makes the effort to provide his sources, both things I'm very big on, so I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I will say too that of all the claims I'm examining in this video, the idea that this 1926 photo shows the Lyndhurst portrait is the strongest in my opinion. There's no slam dunk evidence that this is the case, but I concede that they were both in the same area of America within the space of 14 years of each other, and they do look incredibly similar. In fact, of all the B-pattern portraits, I think they are the most alike, and they could be one and the same. Porritt has noted that they have the same measurements of 22.5 by 17 inches, though if we look at the Frick Collection's website it says 17.25 inches for the photograph if we're going to nitpick. Now, I found two sets of measurements for the Lyndhurst portrait. One on lyndhurst.org says 22.5 by 17. The other on the National Trust for Historical Preservation site says 32 by 27 by 3 in what I assume are inches. Certainly the portrait looks too big in photos I've seen of it online hanging on a wall for those measurements to be in centimetres. This discrepancy in measurements might be accounted for by the frame, which does look pretty large. I think these virtually identical numbers are indeed a weighty piece of evidence in favour of the portrait in the photo and the Lyndhurst painting being one and the same, and well done to Mr. Porritt for noticing this, as to the best of my knowledge, he's the person who put this together. There certainly wasn't that level of detail in the Roland H. comment, for instance. That said, there are still some problems to overcome in making a case for the two pictures to be the same item. This brings us to the captions on the two images, which are different. On the 1926 portrait, the words above Anne's head read, Anna Regina Uxor to H8, meaning Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. On the Lyndhurst portrait, there is an extra letter because it reads Anna Regina Uxor to A H8. Now, Porritt does attempt to address this by saying that after manipulating the photo, the faint A is there on the Howard Young photograph too. But in my opinion, the photo was not in need of manipulation, as it's already very clear and the Frick Collection website allows one to zoom in on it very tight, and I don't see that extra A. I mean, assuming you're watching this video and not just listening to it, do you see it? It should be in superscript to the top right of the number 2. Furthermore, paperwork which goes with the 1926 photograph is also available on the Frick Collection's website, and it gives the shorter inscription without the A. I don't think it dates to 1926 though, because footnotes at the bottom of the page contain the dates 1933 and 1936, so I assume this document was typed up in 1936 or later. Still, perhaps the person who typed it was able to see the original portrait and double check it. We just don't know. One could argue that this extra A was added in between 1926 and 1940, but what would be the point of that? LaVasse offers no answer. In fact, she quotes the photograph's inscription with the A, even though it is, at the very least, not really visible to the naked eye and perhaps not there at all, and she does not discuss the discrepancy in her book. To sum this section up, further analysis of the Lyndhurst portrait to see if it's been overpainted and if so in what way, as well as clarification as to what its measurements with and without the frame are, would be needed to ascertain if the theory that it's the Howard Young image is true. It's certainly an interesting idea though, and something which Porritt has me seriously considering, despite my reservations about that extra A, which I would really like to be able to see, but I just couldn't convince myself it was there even when I went nose to screen with my laptop. It would be nice if I was wrong though, because it would be lovely to be able to connect these two portraits. Now let's discuss one of the only things I read in LaVasse's chapter on the Lumley portrait, which appears to me to have come from her. This is her claim that she's colorized and enhanced the 1926 sepia photograph and revealed that there are Tudor roses around the edge of Anne's dress. It will perhaps come as no surprise to you when I say that I see no such thing. Furthermore, when I looked at her so-called enhancements, they rendered the inscription along the top of the image virtually illegible to me, the pearls on Anne's headdress and necklace looked blurry, and the delicate detailing on her shift, that's the black pattern you can see on the white rim around her neckline, was almost obliterated. Another theory she puts forward, and which I found difficult to even follow, has to do with the pearls beneath the B pendant. In the Howard Young photograph and the Lyndhurst portrait, these pearls are splayed rather than falling straight down as we see in many other B-pattern portraits. LaVasse writes that, quote, "The pearls on the Howard portrait are splayed and imperfect, with no shadowing beneath them, a sign that they may have been painted from life due to how large pearls laying against skin would appear." Sorry, what? Why do splayed pearls mean that the portrait is more likely to be painted from life as opposed to pearls hanging directly beneath the bee? I would have thought the opposite was true unless the pearls were wired to stay sitting out in this unnatural position. Also, why do pearls painted from life cast no shadow beneath them, no matter the light source? Oh, and has anyone else noticed that the pearls in the Howard Young photo actually are casting shadows off to our left, just as the pearls on the necklace are, telling us that the light source for this painting was coming from screen right, and totally negating this whole silly discussion about pearl shadows. Also, just for the record, the Howard Young and Lyndhurst images are not the only B-pattern portraits that show Anne with splayed pearls. The Royal Collection Trust holds another version of this portrait with the same detail, which was probably purchased by Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, and no one from the RCT, as far as I am aware, is claiming that it was painted from life. The Royal Collection dates it to circa 1550 to 1699, and it hangs in Hampton Court Palace, which is where I photographed it. LaVasse shows it elsewhere in her book, but doesn't think fit to mention it in the chapter about the Lumley, Howard Young and Lyndhurst portraits, even though it's nearly identical to the latter two. While we're comparing the RCT picture to the Lyndhurst painting, let's discuss the red mantle at the bottom of both. If the Lyndhurst was originally a full-length image of Anne, this red mantle surely wouldn't be there, covering up the lower portion of her body. So to argue that the Lyndhurst and the Lumley are the same image, you have to argue, I think, that the mantle was added in later, after the portrait was fire damaged and cut down. If you argue that the mantle is there to hide some fire damage, I would say, why would anyone bother going to so much trouble when they could have just cut the portrait higher to get rid of that fire damage? Now let's focus on the Royal Collection Trust image at Hampton Court Palace. You'll recall it's dated to 1699 at the latest. This means it was almost certainly in existence before the Lumley was fire damaged, and certainly before it was cut down in 1736. In other words, if the Lyndhurst painting is the long-lost full-length Lumley portrait with a mantle added in during or after 1736, then why is it nearly identical to a bust-length portrait of Anne that existed before it was supposedly cut to that size and possibly had a mantle painted onto it? You would need to be suggesting that the Royal Collection's portrait was copied from the Lumley picture while it was still full-length, but that the copyist decided to cut it off just below the bust and then add in a red mantle, just for kicks. Decades later, the Lumley portrait is cut down and someone decides to add in a red mantle, nearly identical to the Royal Collection's portrait, but not to other B patterns, and again, just for the thrill of it. Can we be serious, please? That didn't happen, in my opinion. The Lyndhurst might be the same portrait seen in the Howard Young photo, but they are not the Lumley, and if by some fluke that mantle was added on long after the rest of the portrait was completed, that fact should be ascertainable through analysis of the painting. Of course, the whole issue of the mantle isn't discussed by LaVasse, nor does Masefield mention it. It's just something I was thinking about once I started looking at the Royal Collection's painting again. So to sum up this complicated mess, because I wouldn't blame you if you were feeling very lost by now, with no actual evidence that I've seen to support it, and in contradiction of evidence we do have from the likes of wills and leases, in 2017 Masefield put forth the idea that Anne Boleyn was painted by the artist Van Cleve in 1532, and that portrait went from Anne of Cleves to Lord Arundel to Lumley, possibly to Prince Henry Stuart, then eventually, after a few more adventures, became the Howard Young Gallery photograph of 1926. He doesn't specifically state in his blog article that the pictures he's showing in it are from the Frick Collection website, but I think you can tell just looking at them that they are showing the same photograph, or at least a photograph of the same portrait, even though he apparently sourced his pictures from other places. Mind you, those other places, an unspecified bio of Henry VIII and Alison Weir's website, could, for all we know, have originally gotten them from the Howard Young Gallery's collection or the Frick collection. Beneath his blog post in a comment, someone called Roland H. suggested that the Howard Young photo showed by Masefield showed the Lyndhurst portrait. I don't know if that user was the first person to ever make that connection, but the same theory appeared in an expanded form in 2020 on the Lady Jane Grey Revisited website and may or may not have been independently thought up by its creator Lee Porritt. Finally, Elizabeth LaVasse has, in my opinion, plagiarised both ideas by sticking the two theories together and almost entirely presenting them as her own in 2024. That's how we arrive at her claim that she's not only found the Lumley portrait, but that she can trace its entire provenance back to Anne Boleyn's lifetime. Now, if it isn't clear to you already, there is in fact absolutely nothing to join the dots between the real Lumley portrait, last seen in 1773, and the Howard Young photograph, or the Lyndhurst portrait, and you would think that after everything I've talked about in this video, I'd be done by now. But no, there's more. The back of the Lyndhurst painting states that it was painted by Johannes Corvus, a Flemish painter active during Henry VIII's reign, not Van Cleve, while the Lumley portrait was listed as a Holbein in 1773, though of course these could all be misattributions, as could the name of the sitter as being Anne Boleyn. If it did happen to be a real Holbein though, I have to say that I don't think the 1926 photo or the Lyndhurst picture, which I find rather crude and which I think show Anne with slightly uneven eyes and a lazy eye on her left or right, were painted by one of the Tudors' most skillful artists, nor is there any surviving preparatory sketch amongst the Holbein sketches we have which matches this painting. Furthermore, I would disagree with Masefield that it looks like a Van Cleve painting. I think that artist was far more skilled than this as well. Just check out some of his other works. Also overlooked is the fact that the National Trust for Historic Preservation's website discussion of this portrait dates it to 1550 to 1850, though I don't know what they're basing that on, and says that it's a copy of the Holbein in the National Gallery in London. Now clearly this is wrong, and I think it's a reference to the National Portrait Gallery's B pattern portrait, whose artist is unknown, but which you'll recall dates to 1584 or later, meaning it was created decades after Holbein's death. There is no known Holbein of Anne. The website of the National Trust for Historic Preservation also associates the painting not just with Johannes Corvus, who died before 1550, so couldn't have painted this if it dates to after that point, but also with Joseph Hogfoot for reasons which are unknown to me. Maybe Hogfoot was the man who photographed it? By the by, Van Cleve died in about 1541, so he couldn't have created something in the 1550s either. To get me to even start considering the idea that the Lyndhurst portrait has anything to do with the Lumley, you'd need to test the wood it's painted on and date it to 1590 or earlier. I'd also want to see evidence of something like soot or burn damage, or maybe a label associating it with Lumley, James West, or Nonsuch Palace, and I'm sure if such a label existed, unless it's under paint, that information would be in the public domain by now. You'd also have to explain away why the Royal Collection has a near identical bust-length portrait with red mantle at the bottom, which seems to have existed before the Lumley was cut down to its unknown size, before becoming, in this theory, the Lyndhurst. To conclude, I found most of the theories presented in Ms LaVasse's book about the history of the Lumley portrait before 1590 and after 1773 to be completely unproved, as well as some of what she claimed happened to it in between, and in many cases I didn't even believe she'd come up with those theories herself. I am not linking it below for you because I would never encourage you to spend your money on something I believe to be as bad as this. While I have no problem with self-publishing, I've done it myself after all with my book on finding your Irish ancestors online, I think its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, and that is that anyone can publish pretty much anything. There's no quality control beyond what the author puts in place themselves, and I think the example we've looked at today shows how dire the consequences of that can, on occasion, be. Sadly, a few other online content creators seem to have been suckered by this whole thing, and unfortunately, I think it reflects poorly on them if they've allowed their platforms to be used to promote such rubbish. I actually think you don't need much knowledge of Anne Boleyn to be able to see how poor the quality of LaVasse's work is, So I would be very wary of people presenting themselves as historical experts who buy into this, as I think it speaks volumes as to their own critical thinking and research abilities or lack thereof. It took me less than 2 days to assemble the research for this video. That's how easy it was to demolish this story and spot what I believe to be widespread plagiarism. I'm not going to name those other content creators here, but I assume that the person who asked me to look into this story heard about it in one of those places, which just shows how easily misinformation can spread and why it's so important to be careful about what you're putting out into the world. If you really love and respect history, the lives of historical figures, and the work of real historians, then I think you need to be careful not to promote fantasy stories like those I've ripped apart in this video. I hope I've covered all aspects of this tale in this episode. I only had 5 days total to create it, so I hope you'll forgive me for not going down the rabbit holes I spoke about, like trying to find even earlier mentions of some of the theories mentioned by LaVasse, or that biography of Henry VIII that Masefield mentioned. If you find any additional information which you think is pertinent to this topic, please do leave it in the comments below. I'd be very grateful if you would give this video a like and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on to get a little ding when I next upload. You can also get more from me by becoming a YouTube member or by joining my Patreon site at patreon.com/historycalling. Let me know if you think the 1926 photo and the Lyndhurst portrait are one and the same, and to hear me tearing apart other claims which I consider to be fake history, watch one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.